Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this turbulent, fast forward planet, which is wrapped in a pandemic still. It doesn't feel that way to many of us now, but it is. There's still a couple billion people on the planet who've never seen one vaccine shot, let alone been boosted. It's a planet still feeling reverberations from Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which of course goes on and is a daily tragedy, and also could lead to a nuclear crisis. It is a human heated planet. As I've been writing for 35 years, and it's a planet in which a key kind of human capacity is needed a lot, which is how to absorb a blow or foresee a blow and do something about it that can mitigate not only your risk, but that of the people who are most vulnerable around you. The catchword for some of this is resilience. You've heard a lot about climate adaptation. We're going to talk through those terms and get to what they actually mean and feel and are like on the ground through the wonderful work of Virginia Hanusik, who's a photographer based in Louisiana, and Rob Verchick, a law professor, heads a program at Loyola New Orleans University that's highly relevant, has written a book called The Octopus in the Parking Garage. And I thought just before we get into all this, I'm going to play the Facebook posting by a guy named Richard Conlon, who's a realtor who in 2016 found something weird going on in the garage in his building in Miami. So let's go to the videotape, as they say. So this relates to rising seas, of course, are creating more odds of having a sunny day flooding, or when you have a king tide, a higher than usual tide, you can do lots of things to communities that are along waterfronts or have porous soils, so the water comes up. And this is part of it. Here's another shot. And then there was this, and this is what caught the media's attention. Octopi are incredibly agile and resilient, speaking of resilience, and can squeeze through tight spaces. This one probably came up through the storm drains and the like, and there it is again. And Rob, you've been thinking about resilience and adaptation and climate policy for a couple of decades, but something about this crystallized into a book for you. So we're going to talk about that. Let's just get to this moment back in 2016. What did you actually see the Facebook post or just some of the media around it? And then how did that relate to your long-term interest in this issue?
Well, of course, I had been interested in climate resilience and disasters since Hurricane Katrina, which I actually went through down here in New Orleans. But a friend of mine actually sent me that meme, a friend from Berkeley named Dan Farber, who's also a law professor who writes about resilience and disaster. And I said, "Is that real?" He said, "Yeah, it's real." And then we figured out it was related to climate, right? It was related to sea level rise and, of course, these extreme tides and so on. And I said to him, I said, "Well, if we can't keep octopuses out of parking garages, what else can't we do at this point?" And so we wrote an op-ed actually for the Miami Herald called "The Octopus in the Parking Garage," and then I just kept that idea in my head to write a book about climate resilience and all of the things that we need to be able to anticipate and prepare for. And I thought, I like the idea of the octopus because it was unusual and memorable, and it wasn't in itself scary, I didn't think. And one of the things that I was really trying to do in this book was talk to people about something very serious, of course, but by bringing them in with a story that wouldn't be so threatening, I thought, because when we feel threatened and scared, we lock up, and then we have a hard time acting out something. And so I tried throughout to make this book respectful of the seriousness of the topic, but at the same time to be open enough with narratives and stories and people so that we could relate to it and hopefully face this issue and then develop some resilience.
And Virginia, you're also again in Louisiana. I can't remember if you were born there or did you migrate there?
I moved here in 2014. I'm from upstate New York. I'm from the Hudson Valley.
Oh, right. We were just talking about that.
Mhm.
Where I lived half of my life, the last 30
Yeah.
something years. Rob, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Las Vegas. I am third
Ah,
generation Las Vegas. And so I know about not having enough water. But I
interesting.
also grew up around Lake Mead, right? And
Sure.
which is, of course,
Speaking of,
connected to the Colorado River and a subject of a lot of discussion now. And of course, on the Mojave Desert. And so I write about the Mojave Desert and Joshua Tree National Park as well in the book.
right. And Virginia, what drew you to photography? You call yourself an artist, which is distinct from like a photojournalist or the like. So just talk about your approach to imagery.
Yeah, my background is in architecture, actually. So I got into photography on a whim when I had to take a arts requirement in college. I was probably I was in the minority at where I went to school. I went to Bard College in upstate New York, so very arts focused
Sure.
liberal arts school. And I had to take a course, and it ended up being photography for non-majors. And it was a medium that I just kind of immediately fell in love with as a way to understand and analyze and communicate these larger concepts and ideals in the built environment that I was already studying. So it kind of just went from there. And when I moved here after school, I've been here for almost 10 years. I was actually working for an organization that was doing coastal restoration work. So my photography practice and the work that I was doing in that sort of world blended together, and it's been my focus ever since that.
And you both live in a region that has so many things going on at the same time that amplify coastal challenges. It's subsiding, it's sinking, these big chunks of the coast. It's prone to hurricanes, as anyone who's paid attention to weather the last 30 years, or actually the last 100 years, would know. It's a city that Pierce Lewis, the historian, New Orleans is a city that he called impossible and inevitable. That might be, I don't know if that line is in your book, but it rings in my head all the time, not just in looking at New Orleans, but looking at so many places that human dynamics have superimposed our presence because it's useful or aesthetically pleasing or the place to go and dangerous in some way or other. So you're in this landscape change. And now, of course, with global warming, you have sea level rise for centuries to come, changes in weather patterns, the rainfall. Is that Virginia? And then we'll get back to your book, Rob. How does that drive your work? You started in architecture. Were you focused on that issue, resilience, from the very beginning, or was it more like you wanted to design buildings and realized these other factors have to come into play?
Yeah, I think my mind just naturally goes to thinking structurally and how we build upon space. I have I put together some photos, but whenever you want me to share
Yeah,
them,
we could show those too, sure.
okay, cool.
If you hit share screen, there's like a two-step process, then I can share them.
Okay, so if I do present here,
Yeah, whatever. I can't remember what you see, but just hit that key
yeah,
and then I can activate it. But your work generally has been, oh, here we go.
we're good.
Yeah, 1 second and I will, if do you have to maximize the screen or right now I see, yes, let's see if that works. Hold on. There we go.
Can you see that?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
And
cool.
I love, by the way, you do these pieces that are also atmospheric and you're kind of celebrating the aesthetic of that region, even as you also are chronicling change and damage. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate that because I it's an intentional attempt on my end. Just to touch on that quickly, a lot of my work is influenced by the landscape that I grew up in, which is the Hudson Valley. and thinking about the history of landscape representation and what regions or parts of the country are seen as beautiful and worthy of conservation, of protection, and kind of where that hierarchy of scenery started with the Hudson River School and the paintings that were done in the mid 19th century. So thinking about the picturesque and kind of how the American canon of landscape art in general, what places are left out of that historically, and the Gulf Coast being one of those places. So with my work, I'm trying to really have a conversation with that history and providing additional imagery and ways of kind of seeing this place that's not so focused heavily on disaster imagery, which I think has been the dominant visual when talking about specifically New Orleans, South Louisiana, in the context of hurricanes, flooding, these other types of disasters. So, but to kind of get to your first question about architecture and how New Orleans is an impossible yet inevitable city, my work really looks at the engineering that we've done to exist here and have built on this land that has always meant to be changing and shifting with the course of the Mississippi River over time, and kind of the ways that we've really manipulated the natural environment here, and what kind of artifacts and monuments poke out in that landscape, and talk about this conflict that has only been getting more severe with the impacts of climate change. And not to give the full presentation or anything here, but just some examples of that imagery and how the ways of we've imposed this very hard structural form on a landscape, the juxtaposition of having that with the impacts of climate change with sea level rise and coastal erosion. So my work is trying to kind of get at the ways that we've adapted, intervened, and thinking about kind of the speculative types of futures that are in front of us with the limits of building the way that we have been, and thinking about ways that we can potentially be building in a more just and equitable and sustainable way.
Yeah, that, and a lot of those themes are in Rob's book too, especially the justice theme. To me, as a reporter, I started on this question 1988, really, with this artifact, my 1988 cover story on global warming. And it had some sections on vulnerability and development. The different countries are at different stages of development. But it really, for putting the CO2 in the atmosphere, we need to cut CO2, and that will solve what we call the climate problem. And as I got deeper into this stuff, I realized, oh, no, it's not like that at all. CO2 matters, but vulnerability, you have to cut vulnerability now. And it's usually a matter of a justice question. Who is in harm's way is frequently, if not almost all, a function of an unbalanced landscape of risk. So Rob, take us through, I want to show a couple of slides that'll help take us through your book too. Hold on one second. Where am I here? Entire screen. There's no producer behind the scenes here. It's just me. So I got to know you. I think oh shoot, I did it again. Maybe, I think it was 2010 might've been the first time we intersected.
Yeah.
I wrote, when you had this book out, Facing Catastrophe, Environmental Action for the Post-Katrina World, you were at that time in the Obama administration, or maybe roughly?
Yeah, I was. I had written the book before while I was at Loyola, and then the book came out while I was in the administration, working on the president's climate change adaptation task force.
Right. And tell us a little bit about that journey here to the new book. And here's your Twitter page. Twitter is still my shorthand for where people live who are trying to make a difference in the world. If you cut behind all the Musk style noise, it's still an incredibly useful platform. So anyway, take us through. You built the book around the initial experience of this sunny day flood, but what were your core takeaways?
The first thing I wanted to do was make it a really engaging and readable book for ordinary readers, which is something that I hadn't done before. The book that you showed previously was more of an academic book,
right?
Or for policymakers, I suppose. This book is for everybody, and I wanted to. I wanted to show the diversity of the things that people were doing to adequately prepare for climate change, whether that's large structural initiatives that governments pursue or whether it's community action in various ways. I wanted to show a range of geography. So I write about wildfires in the Pacific Northwest and California. I write about coastal restoration in Louisiana, about power outages in New York City. And all places that I know pretty well and love, because I wanted people to feel that and to feature stories of people doing things like Sharon Levine, who's an environmental justice advocate, retired special needs teacher turned international advocate on environmental justice, working down in the southern parishes. Chief Sherelle Parfait-Dardar, who's a leader of an indigenous tribe in southern Louisiana, working to protect their homelands. And a 15-year-old student, Karen Norman, who lives in Key West and is a master scuba diver and works on peer review marine research as a young person who is trying to restore coral at scale. If I could, I just wanted, one of the things that I also try to do in the book is show that although we live in obviously very exceptional times with the urgency that climate change creates, we have always, as a species, been adapting to climate in fluctuations in climate that occur over a much larger period of time. But I mean, we evolved that way, back even, a million years ago. So much of what our brain and our language and our social activity is all the result of these kinds of challenges. And Virginia reminded me in her beautiful work, because I agree, this landscape is gorgeous down here. And even when it's got concrete as part of it, it's beautiful and you can love it. And, we've had people living in this area that Virginia was photographing for at least 3,500 years. The poverty point people and indigenous people had one of the most complex societies in all of North America. And they built large mounds, sometimes 70 feet high, in order so they could conduct their business, their rituals, and so on. They were masterminding and landscaping this area thousands and thousands of years ago. And so there's nothing new in itself about molding a landscape so that you can thrive. But we have to think about it differently and do it much faster.
I put together some images that I thought were fun to throw in. It's in the Bible. Someone on Twitter pointed me to Matthew 7:24.
That's nice.
The wise and foolish builders. And there's a book for, if you're a religious Christian, for your kids on how to survive hard knocks in life. It's a kid's book, The Wise and Foolish Builders. Therefore, everyone who hears the words of mine, puts them into practice, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because its foundation is on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them in practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And it goes on. So as you say, these are not new ideas. I'm also reminded in Japan of when I wrote about the tsunami, the terrible 2011 tsunami. The history tells us so much that in Japan, there were these tsunami stones that had been put in place on the hillsides centuries earlier that had inscriptions like, remember the waves, the big waves, do not build below this point. And then the impossible, inevitable human surge kind of returns. It's such an interesting challenge. You also you split the book into sort of the phenomenon and the challenges, and then the doing part. The last year's IPCC report had a big section on a new section by Ed Carr, who's going to be on the show next Wednesday. He's been on before, about climate resilient development. But it's all very macro. It's all like flow charts and stuff. And it's focused on development in a way that I still feel kind of biases us toward what we call undeveloped countries, developing countries, and doesn't say a lot about that think of themselves as developed, but are, we also build vulnerability and we create it through our injustice in our systems. So how do you break down the sort of the solutions part, the action part? And I want to get Virginia, you've written about this issue too. You're not just an image maker. You've done some writing I'm going to point to in a minute.
Well, let me say, start out with just defining resilience, because people often ask me about that, and
Right.
biologists have different, people use resilience in different ways depending on their discipline and their interests. When I talk about resilience, I mean bouncing back better, if you want to think of it that way, to a state in which people not are just surviving, but they're thriving. And we talk about resilience a lot as a society today. We talk about emotional resilience and so on. You go through a bad part of your life, and the goal isn't just to motor through it. The goal is to do some self-inquiry and development and become a more robust person in the future. And that's what I hope for communities building resilience. And part of that, as you say, is it's understanding the vulnerability, and part of the vulnerability is geophysical. Obviously, you're close to hurricanes or wildfires, whatever it is. The other part of the vulnerability is this social, cultural, economic vulnerability, which we've seen so much of in the press. And as you point out, people who lack money or resources to do things or to protect themselves in some way. And that can relate to race and gender identity and so on. If what we want out of resilience is to reduce harm and make our lives better, we have to address both of those kinds of vulnerability at the same time.
Right.
Which is why we have to actually transform what our societies look like. Because having a really great seawall and still having people who are poor or disadvantaged or unable to choose in a marketplace of property where they can live and be safe, you haven't accomplished what you really want to accomplish. So it takes some interior work as well. The last thing I'll just say is that, there's a big picture idea. I mean, I work for the federal government with 14 agencies, and we're trying to figure out, okay, what does the Department of Transportation, what's their view on climate resilience? That's big picture. Today, often I talk to community groups, and I remind them that the most expansive kind of regulation in the United States is zoning and land use, which is very local. And the power grid in some ways is regulated in a state-based local way with these utility commissions. And so if you go to a hearing in a utility commission and you say, hey, how have you looked at climate projections about rain and wind, or are you just looking backwards to prepare? That's a simple question that anybody could ask,
Right.
but it could lead to some dramatic change. And you could do the same thing in your city planning hearings and so on.
By the way, I'm still on Starlink. My internet is not a hard line, so if I freeze, let's be resilient and just talk to each other. It usually passes after like 30 seconds. But I just did a show a week ago on tornadoes and resilience and design, and there are clear action points at each level, federal, state, local, and industrial, that come glaringly out of the conversation. One is HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Agency, which you don't think of as when you think of FEMA or you think of the EPA or NOAA. They set the standards for building codes for manufactured housing. Mobile homes, they're called, although the industry resists that. They say mobile homes don't exist anymore. It's manufactured homes. And zone 3 standards, which are the ones that came out of Hurricane Andrew in Florida, are still only applied on the coasts. They're not applied in tornado zones. That seems to be a real opportunity or responsibility gap. But then it's like what I was told was some states are better than others. Florida actually is very moved ahead with the housing standards, but the Carolinas, Tennessee, if the state doesn't take on the responsibility, mandate the codes, and inspection, is really important too. And then at the community scale, people have to know what they're getting into.
Well, a lot of it's about knowledge and resources. I found when I was at the EPA, we had a number of memoranda of understanding with other agencies, in which what we would lend them is information about climate change. And we worked with HUD, and we worked with Department of Agriculture, which does a surprising amount of building of rural communities too. And one of the things that we tapped into is there are tens of thousands of communities in the United States that all need hazard mitigation plans. And they write their hazard mitigation plan preparing for whatever disasters they see. But they don't use very much climate information. And when I was in the administration, we were trying to lend a hand with that. But so many of these towns and cities, they have consultants who write cookie cutter hazard mitigation plans. And they don't really have the wherewithal to learn about some of these things, even though they might be very interested. And I think that's a way to crack it, because if you have tens of thousands of communities that all need a hazard mitigation plan, if you could just insert, a climate assessment in every single one of those, you would have transformative change.
And as I was saying a minute ago, Virginia, you've written about this in the past. I'm not sure how long ago this was, but there are these tendencies that cut against progress, at least in reducing vulnerability for those most at risk now because of marginalization. Or one is climate gentrification. I haven't done a full program on it, but we could certainly spend days on this. When you, as thinking about your architecture background, knowing what you know about codes and what you've seen as a photographer, where are the gaps? What's the issues that could be addressed that aren't being addressed?
Well, I think that with my work, looking at the physical components of the landscape as a means to see how these policies and kind of invisible mechanisms are being physically manifested. So, for example, a project that I'm working on in developing right now is around disaster relief and flood insurance. So looking at 5 sites along the Gulf Coast that have been repeatedly or recently impacted by hurricanes or flooding events, and kind of tracking, in some cases, what neighborhoods or areas are rebuilding faster, the recovery rates there, as a means of kind of unpacking these, like I said, hidden policies that are literally shaping the future of the coastal zone in terms of who's actually going to be able to live there and who has access to funding mechanisms that would enable them to, oh my God, my Twitter.
No, it's
Wow,
good.
you're going deep, Andrew. Okay, cool.
That's a big resolution, Virginia.
Yeah.
Wait, what did you say?
That's a big resolution to understand flood
insurance.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I have been developing. When I say in development, it has taken me a very long time to understand flood insurance. And I think that that's, an intentional, that's intentional. It's meant to be opaque. And I think the transparency of that, or the lack thereof, keeps people in the dark of how these systems are really shaping who is able to build back. Rob, like you said, the idea of bouncing back better, that is not, even the concept of bouncing back is not accessible to people across the board. It comes down to access to wealth, to all of these factors that I think a lot of times disasters perpetuate or make the status quo worse in terms of what people, their socioeconomic standing. So, and also thinking about architecture, like with what you were saying around the cookie cutter types of hazard mitigation plans, going across the Louisiana coast, you have homes that are raised 20 feet, you have homes that are raised 16 feet, 6 feet on slab on grade still. So looking at the built environment as a way to see that there is no comprehensive plan for climate adaptation, and how that range of elevation and structures really visualizes the individual solutions to a systemic problem like climate change, right? So I think talking about post-hurricane, post-disaster in Louisiana, especially, Louisianans are considered so resilient, bouncing back from storms. I think it's kind of become problematic in a way where we're relying on individuals, like I said, to kind of provide these ad hoc solutions or do what they can, when the problem is systemic and requires a much bolder and bigger response and solution to it.
Yeah, this where government intervention can make a difference and where it doesn't get sort of in the mix. This just one brief thing you both know a lot about is the history of flood insurance. There was a moment under the Obama administration when Congress, at its most polarized peak, passed a revision that sort of made the cost of insurance reflect the risk. And several things happened, one of which was that people, Republicans and Democrats, freaked out, who saw it as a taking. It was taking the future value of their houses. So there's been several iterations of that, where efforts to get the politics aligned with the science really don't survive. Rob, you've probably dealt with that more than most other people I know. So what, is there a solution there?
How do you solve that? Yeah. Virginia's hit it on the head, right? Is that we are looking to people to make individual choices, when what we really have is a larger solution, need a larger framework, particularly about people relocating. So I'm sort of of two minds on the insurance. I mean, I'm all for sending signals in the marketplace and so on where people can afford them. But you've got a lot of people who are living in flood-prone areas that are not fancy places. They're in flood zones near rivers and things like that. And they're there in part maybe because of a racialized housing market over time, or because they don't have a lot of money. And then all of a sudden you're going to say, well, let's raise your premium to actuarial levels, and now the one asset you own is worth zero because nobody wants to buy it. That is not the solution, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that one, right? But it's complicated because money has to be made available. The other thing that makes it complicated is you need cooperation. So, and I know, Andy, I think you know of the study of Matt Howers, who's now in Florida. He picked up on a number which the federal government uses that says something like 12 million people living on the coast will be relocating in the next 50 years or whatever it is. And so Matt wanted to know, well, where are these 12 million people going to go? And so he looked at cities like Miami and New Orleans and San Francisco and LA, and said, okay, where do people like that tend to move when they move? And they tend to move, he kind of mapped it all out. So the places where people are going to be leaving are places like I just said. Where people are going to be moving are places like Las Vegas, Austin, Texas, Orlando, right, Florida, Atlanta, and so on. And spoiler alert, these cities have no idea that all of these people are planning to come. And so without some kind of without some kind of, I think, government framework that encourages these communities to be talking now about what that is going to look like. Otherwise, it's going to be very chaotic and sort of like pandemonium.
Yeah, that gets at a concept I've done several episodes of Sustain What On, which is there's one end of it is called managed retreat. The other end is called facilitating mobility.
Yes.
Receiving cities To me, so much of the media focus has been on the idea of refugees or dislocation, and not enough on what would a dynamic look like that creates, as some people again say, receiving cities, where there's pull as well as the dire sense of people being dislocated involuntarily, which is happening for economic and other reasons, as well as, people coming to the border of the United States are coming there not just because of climate change, they're coming there because of all kinds of factors pushing them. So having more pull, what does pull look like, is a really important question.
Well, there are a number of communities. I'll just put this out to sort of talk a little more about the equity part. There are a number of communities in the U.S. that are actively seeking to move in total as a group. And I was a part of some research a few years back trying to identify those places. We found about 12 of them, and they were all indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
Most in Alaska, a few in Washington State, and then, of course, the Ile-de-Jean-Charles tribe in southern Louisiana. And there's no formal program to facilitate that at all.
For sure. Yeah, I visited that community.
Yes, we went down to Ile-de-Jean-Charles, right?
Yeah. And you took a picture of me on the flooded road.
Yeah, we were on a flooded road, and every one of us took a picture. It's called Island Road, and it's the one road that goes to Ile-de-Jean-Charles.
And Virginia, so many of your photographs of our buildings on stilts and the like in these regions. Do you already have, through your work, Virginia, on the present, what's in front of you now, have you been able to do your own sort of envisioning process on, like, if you could put two tracks in your brain? One would be a Louisiana that heeds not just the science, but the basic understanding, and one that's sort of heedless. What would that look like?
Well, I think in the past couple of years, especially for me, has been becoming okay and understanding the limits of my own medium with photography and visual art, and really working to connect with organizations and folks that are doing the grassroots, on the ground work of climate justice, and thinking about how to organize and build a sustainable future that is both equitable and also addresses the injustices of the past. And I think that with infrastructure, especially looking at that, there's a lot of violence and inequality built into that, and the legacy of that. Just thinking about in South Louisiana, the history of the levee system being intentionally and unintentionally destroyed, in the 1927 flood, thinking about how St. Bernard Parish was ultimately treated as a sacrifice zone for New Orleans, and the levee was blown up and flooded communities there, and kind of the legacy of distrust that this infrastructure has, while at the same time banking on these physical aspects to really, it can't just be infrastructure solve all. It's not going to solve all of our problems with the climate crisis. It can't be something where the $14 billion levee system that was built after Hurricane Katrina is going to hold back the Gulf of Mexico. So thinking about the ways that our coastal systems are interconnected to our, thinking about what you were saying about managed, the idea of managed retreat and that term. You don't have to be moving to other states even. It's something that's happening in real time in Plaquemines Parish and other coastal parishes, with folks moving who have the means to move, right, and still sell, their homes, moving into the protected levee system. So, but at the same time, if you're losing that land, the risk increases for that levee, that hard infrastructure, to not perform at the level that it was intended to. So that's just to say, these physical monuments that I think that we or have been told to believe are all encompassing of the ideals of protecting like our cities and our landscapes that it surrounds, they sometimes fail, and we have to be investing in, you know, what Rob was talking about, the social components of resilience too, and making sure that communities that have historically been left out of that conversation and adversely impacted by infrastructure have a seat at the table in terms of developing these solutions and what the future plans look like. So I think this is a long-winded answer to what you had originally asked, but with my work, it's been important for me to kind of bring in folks who are doing that advocacy work, like you had mentioned with Sharon Levine, with Rise St. James, Healthy Gulf, Louisiana Just Recovery Network, Gulf South for a Green New Deal, all of these organizations that are really putting in the work to organize and advocate for a equitable and just future.
So interesting. This issue of, I wrote about this in the wake of the infrastructure bill being passed, and I, like many, there's been much great coverage of the how the structural imbalances, not just the dams, like you were talking about, the levees, but laws and norms and administrative procedures benefit those with the resources to use them. Bloomberg folks did a great package a year or so ago on, you know, the Hamptons billionaires who navigate FEMA and other money pots to replenish their beaches, when that money, you know, if your focus was on cutting vulnerability, that money could go elsewhere for sure. And how, I think what you were just saying about the distributed network of NGOs and organizations is really vital. What I wonder about is how can some of the, I guess I'll back up. A lot of federal funding is kind of project-based as opposed to capacity-based. And Rob, what do you think about that? How do you use some of these bounties, both for energy and resilience now, that are there to bolster capacity more than build something or move something?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really big challenge in the Biden administration. They're doing very good things. There's an executive order that says that 40% of the benefits of these funded projects should go to disadvantaged communities. We all agree on that, or many agree on that.
Right here.
But the problem is, first of all, defining all of that. What does 40% of the benefits mean?
Right.
What does a disadvantaged community mean?
Right.
And the second problem is that there really needs to be capacity building on the part of the communities, because a lot of these grants are competitive, which means that the community that's able to come up with the best proposal, with the best science behind it, and the most compelling narrative is the one that's going to get that funding. And I mean, I've been involved in groups here in Louisiana, and many groups trying to figure out, okay, how do we get part of that pie? How do we get part of that money? Because otherwise Texas is going to get it, or something like this. Yeah. And it's really hard because there isn't enough federal money that has been earmarked for the capacity building. And so that is something that's being taken on. Some of it's being taken on by federal agencies, but a lot of it has to be taken on by non-governmental organizations who are spending time trying to build exactly this kind of capacity that Virginia is talking about, and that is so important. You know.
There's a question that came in from Carlos Torres on YouTube. If he's still there, well, folks can watch this afterwards. Carlos says, "Can public land trust moves be part of the kit of parts to figure out some of the frameworks to separate the land and the home from the cruelty of the real estate market?" Also, hi, Ginny. Does this ring some bells?
I'll just say absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually happening in Louisiana. And we wish it were happening at a larger scale, and so on. And I mentioned Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar of the Grand Caillou Dulac tribe down in southern Louisiana, and they are, they're interested in protecting certain of their ancestral lands that are very important to them for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that they do is work with non-governmental organizations to acquire land when it can be acquired, or to acquire conservation easements,
Mm-hmm.
or other legal tools that will protect certain kinds of land.
And is Carlos involved in this stuff, Ginny?
Carlos is a landscape architect. He's a friend of mine. So
yeah, landscape architects matter a lot. I spoke at the ASLA meeting a couple of 3 years ago, I guess, just before COVID. And
I'll tell you why we need more people doing what Carlos Torres is doing, and that is that another issue with the federal government is that when you're trying to build projects, they like to build things that have long track records, which is why, to get to Virginia's point, we have so much concrete, because the Army Corps of Engineers, when it runs its financial models, it says we know exactly what a box canal buried under a road, how much water that's going to move, because we've been doing that for years, even though that might not be a good idea anymore. If you want to do the more landscaped green infrastructure to protect areas, it's all great and everybody's into it. But at the end of the day, you have to say, okay, how much water is that going to store? How much of this and that? And because we don't have the track record, some of it is speculative. And that's why the idea of having pilot projects is so important, because until we have the data, we won't be able to answer those questions in a cost-benefit format.
That's so interesting, that idea of demonstration projects. Steve Schneider, who was a famed climate scientist who came significantly from the social sciences, in 2007, he gave a speech in Australia when he was there. He was like a thinker in residence for a year, I think in Adelaide. And his speech was about part of it was about the value of demonstration projects. He was talking more on the energy emissions side, because when you build a power plant, that maybe some of the CO2 goes into a greenhouse and it engages communities. It gives a visual cue that there's action pathways, that local empowerment. I think in design as well, architects and designers can play a role in that too. Stacy Levy, who's a artist in Pennsylvania, has been on here, and she does sculptures, outdoor sculptures that remediate nutrient pollution in ponds. So it's a floating spiral wetland. And is that, do you see that, Virginia, as part of what you've seen or what you think about too? And it's hard to measure sometimes.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of measuring, I actually just, from my own ignorance, just found this out recently, that when the Army Corps is making, a decision to where to actually locate a piece of infrastructure, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong or if I butcher this, but it is entirely based on property and land value.
That's right.
So, I think actually I was reading this because of what the New York Harbor project that is happening, the proposal, but how it relates here, is putting that infrastructure to protect land values is leaving out kind of communities that may need it more, that don't necessarily have the resources to move or relocate if a disaster were to come, if flooding were to happen, versus protecting areas where a lot of the time those wealthier communities live, who have access to rebuilding and even just moving out of the way of a storm. So I just think that that's really interesting. And the topic of these pilot projects, I think a lot of them are happening in the city of New Orleans, with more and more green infrastructure projects. I'm on the board of directors for the Water Collaborative of New Orleans, which is actually pioneering the first, it's called the Water Justice Fund. So it's taking community input on the stormwater fee that will ultimately happen here in the city of New Orleans. So thinking about drainage and that issue here, that if anyone who lives here understands what neutral ground parking is and just being on edge whenever it rains, and our viral Instagram account that kind of chronicles the potholes and street flooding that happen here on a regular basis. So
what's the account?
I will not say the full name, but it is Look at This Effin' Street, but it is the full F word there.
And Virginia, there in New Orleans, we have this multi-million-dollar project in Gentilly to experiment with all kinds of landscape architecture in order to control stormwater.
Wow. I'll show something from the Instagram feed in a second without showing the name, which I probably Columbia Climate School might not be so thrilled. We're getting toward the end. I think there's some basic principles that comes forward here. One of which is there's certainly something for everyone to do, whether you're an architect, whether you're a journalist, obviously, whether you're an artist, as I said earlier, Stacey Levy and other work like that, whether you're in the bureaucracy, figuring out how to deconstruct. As soon as you kind of step back from the massiveness of the climate problem or the climate vulnerability problem within the climate problem, you can, if you don't get paralyzed by the size of that big thing, climate crisis, there's something for everyone to do. I'm experimenting with visuals. Here's, build forward spongier. This is actually at the Garrison Institute where I used to live in the Hudson Valley. They had an asphalt parking lot, and part of it is a pervious surface parking lot. And right there, you sort of have two different pictures of the future, or the current past, the past and the future. All around us, in New Orleans particularly, you have design problems and solutions. On the left, this is pictures by Coulter, Craig Coulter.
Craig Coulter.
Yeah, he shared these with me a long time ago, after the Baton Rouge flooding, inland flooding was so terrible. The house, on the left, you have a 150-year-old house, which is elevated, and a 1970s or 80s house, which was completely flooded. And I show this to communities, if you're a Republican or Democrat, I don't think you want to live in a place where the picture at the top is the norm. So there's ways to sort of start. On the right is Cold Spring, Ginny. That's a building at the top there, a building that was built 150 years ago, probably. And there's also king tides and flooding. And the one below it was a building being designed by James Hartford, it's a passive house, has hardly any energy use, and it's built to flood. And so that's now standing and doing well. So we're surrounded by possibilities that can then, I think, lead to more pressure at the federal level for action. I don't know if that feels right, Rob. I know it's part of your book.
No, I think, one thing I'll point out for anybody who's been to New Orleans, and driven in New Orleans, one of the things you probably realize is that our roads are like roller coasters, right? We have, that goes up and down, and there's a lot of subsidence in the land. And what a lot of people don't realize is that is in part because we've lost that sponge that you just talked about. Naturally, the water accumulates in the water table, and it actually keeps the soil higher. And our, since the days of levees, our strategy has been to get rid of every drop of water that falls into the city. And we have these massive pumps that pump all this water out. And that keeps us dry, maybe. But the problem is all of that land just sinks and sinks so much faster. And so if you could find a way to keep that water in the ground through rain gardens and the neutral grounds that Virginia was talking about and so on, then we would sort of be floating on our sponge rather than just getting rid of all the water that supports the land.
I'm showing the
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
By the name that shall not be mentioned. This is pretty good. By the way, I think citizen pressure like this can help. I think social media can help. I wrote about this in I think it was Myanmar. People are using social media to identify standing pools of water that can create dengue risk, which of course is a public health risk anywhere, almost anywhere, and it's spreading. So using social media this way, I don't know if you've seen instances where this is, prompting change, but it sure feels like it must be doing something.
Yeah, I think this account is a viral account. It's people upload their own sightings. It's like very citizen science type, if you want to call it that. But also thinking about social media after storms, and I just remember after Ida, just the network and how people were really relying on Instagram and Twitter. But I remember a lot of Instagram usage just around resource sharing and also fundraising efforts and that sort of relief work. So there's definitely a strong need for that.
That's good. Well, and I'm able to do follow-up conversations on here too, so we can. It might be fun to focus on one particular example sometime. We're toward the end of our hour. I wanted to throw one more thing at you, and this is about the importance of real cross-disciplinarity. Let me see if I get this right. Screen. There's a whole disaster scholarship, disaster research community that doesn't seem still to intersect enough with the climate risk community. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because climate change is sort of a super slow-mo version of a disaster. But this gets at a way to deconstruct that social complexity that drives disasters. This Ben Wisner and others, I think as long ago as 2007, wrote a paper that laid out the pressure model for disaster. And you could use this for climate change, for anything. And what you see is these, as you were saying earlier, root causes, dynamic pressures, unsafe conditions being why someone's vulnerable, and the other ones being historic or other or legislative or other factors. And then you have the hazards over at the right. So you have flood, whatever. The cool thing about this model is there's also the release model. This gets to what I was saying earlier about working at different levels. It's something at every level to do. We can't roll back history, but as Jenny was saying, you can sure do some things to remediate or fill gaps. If at the legislative and other levels, as Rob was saying, you can find ways to concretize things like Justice 40. Justice 40 really is about this, moving from the brittle pressure model to the release model, in my mind. And I haven't had Ben Wisner on here yet. He's still around. He's even on Twitter. I think it's Wisner_Ben. But the folks in that community have really taught me a huge amount. And Rob, I assume you probably know some of these folks at the international level.
Oh, it's a great model. I would just add, that model suggests the need for natural science and engineering and for social science. And we also desperately need the humanities involved in all this.
Totally.
One of the things I try to do in my book is bring in literature and art. And obviously, the work that Virginia's doing is again a kind of a connection between all of that. And it's so important because the humanities remind us about why we care about things, and it gives us the energy to move forward.
Absolutely. Well, it's been great having you both on, and there could be some other angles here we can explore in the future discussions. Virginia, I know you've got an exhibit in Chicago right now, I think at Mass something or other.
Yeah, it's at Mass Context, which is in Wicker Park, the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago, but it is up until June 3rd. So if you are in town at all, definitely check it out.
Great. And I think everyone should try to check out the Octopus in the parking garage.
It's got a good cover.
There we go. Keep holding it up. And I like the idea of coming in through a quirky, even funny angle, because again, people get paralyzed by just the sort of pummeling them with dire messaging. I think, speaking of covers, in 1988, this was like warning, Will Robinson.
Yeah.
It was very complex because we were selling cigarettes on the back, even while we were selling climate concern on the front. And I think in a way, the last thing the world needs is more of that. It's important to sort of raise the alarm bell, but there's so many action points here. And to me, communication success, which is what I try to do on my Substack thing, is much more about enabling conversations than trying to stuff stuff down people's throats. So thanks again, Rob Verchick and Virginia Hanusik, for being on Sustain What, which is a platform where I try to kind of explore the intersection of complexity and consequence and make a little progress every week, and then translate it into actual action on the ground. Andy Revkin here in Wabanaki Territory in Maine. I hope everyone is able to have a good weekend this weekend. It sounds like the weather in New Orleans is unusually nice.
Very nice.
So,
Very nice. Yeah.
Here it's gorgeous too. And I do have to set up my show next Wednesday. Well, next Monday, I'm having the show is on this new series called Extrapolations on Apple TV, which is all climate futuring essentially. And on Wednesday, the 19th at 1 p.m., 12:30, I'm doing a show with the authors of the new book, Not Too Late, which is a really, again, it's all focused on.
That's a terrific book.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
It's going to be a fun conversation, I guarantee it. So that's here too. Rebecca Solnit and Jacqueline Gill, Ed Carr. I'm trying to post it. Oh, I see. I didn't. Yeah. This is the website, nottoolateclimate.com. Thanks again. And anyone who's watching, you can save, this will be saved, and you can share the link you're watching on as soon as we're done. Most of the views of this webcast come after the fact. So get out there and push it around. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
It's not too late. All right.